All righty, so we give everybody 2 minutes to join. It looks like we've got a quorum here, so I want to get kicked off with a session today. As I said, my name is Eric Schwacke. I want to thank you for joining us on our session today, which is going to cover sort of strategies and sort of new strategies for reducing API risks across your organization. Quick intro on me. I've been in the security space about 20 years now at this point. I came over to SALT about a month ago or so at this point because I saw obviously that many organizations are utilizing APIs in a variety of different ways. And obviously from a security perspective, how do you secure that stuff and make sure that, the organizations run as smoothly as possible, but also limit the amount of risks associated with API traffic. And so SALT Security was doing some really cool stuff, which is what sort of made me want to join the team here at SALT. On the call with me today as well, I have Nick Rago, who's our CTO here at SALT, been around for a number of years. Nick, could you give the folks a quick intro of yourself, sort of how you came about to be at SALT? And I know you have a title of CTO, but I know you wear multiple hats. So if you just want to let everybody sort of know what you do, that'd be great.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. For those that don't know me, like Eric said, my name is Nick Rago, field CTO. I'm a product strategist also here with SALT Security. Been in the API space for quite a while. Been at SALT now for a few years, but was one of the original employees at a company called Kong. As a lot of you folks may know, is one of the most widely used API gateway technologies really in the world today. In years past, I've helped architect and implement some of the largest digital transformation API management programs really all over North America. So seen a lot on the API journey, run engineering teams and product teams in the past as well, producing APIs and consuming APIs. So I've been around the block as far as APIs are concerned.
Great. Yeah, so he's gonna, Nick is the resident expert. So he's been in all your shoes at some point or another and is very familiar with sort of the challenges that you go through in regards to APIs and the risks associated, but also, of course, the benefits that are a part of this journey of moving to an API first sort of strategy. And that's one of the things, obviously, that we talk about is APIs are this sort of an API first world, even though whether or not you know it, right? It's one of these things of like, if you're not, putting a lot of emphasis around what are you doing for risk reduction with APIs, you sort of probably need to do that because more than likely you are looking at sort of how those are impacting your business and what kind of risks are associated with those. So what we're going to do today is not do a bunch of slides. I mean, I have a handful of slides, but really what we want to do is have a discussion between Nick and I just to go over what are the risks associated with APIs? How can you sort of mitigate some of those risks? Talk about API posture governance, which is a very new thing that we've sort of brought into the fold with some new capabilities. And so we'll cover all of that in the session today, but I want to make it much more of an interactive session with obviously our expert here, Nick, as we talk through some of these things. Before we get into some of the slides, I do have a poll question that I want to start real quick for you to get a sense of where folks in the audience are in their API journey. So we'll go ahead and do this poll, and then we'll give about 30 seconds or so for this to see what we've got in the audience here. So question is, does your organization have a strategy in place for any kind of API posture governance? Yes, planning for it, planning in the next 12 months or 6 months, or I'm not really sure. We don't really have plans yet. So what do we got in the audience here? What about 10 more seconds? We're getting some good responses here.
So far, what I'd expect as things are tallying here and populating.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we'll go ahead and end this poll and we'll share the results out with the folks. So interesting mix. Like Nick said, I think it's, I'm glad to see that there are some posture governance folks that are definitely doing it. And there's a good cadre of you that are also in planning for it. For the people who aren't doing it or they're unsure, hopefully after the session today, you'll be more in the planning stages of this API journey. So let's go and go to the first slide and sort of talk about some of the challenges or some of the driving forces around APIs and what you need to think about in regards to this. The first one is sort of around innovation. It's funny because I was talking to my dad, Nick, and he's he was going to some, insurance site, I believe it was, and he's like, "Hey, is it safe to me to put my credit card number into this insurance site to pay a bill?" Right. And I'm thinking, I'm glad he asked, right? It's a great question to ask, if it's a secure thing. But then I was thinking, this is a really interesting sort of API-ish type question, because there's all these different APIs that are involved in that kind of transaction, right? There's all this innovation that's built up between the medical, insurance groups and the credit card processing groups, and there's all these communications between them with APIs relating to innovation. So that was it sort of piqued my interest on that in regards to innovation. But sort of what are you seeing in regards to innovation, how it's impacting how organizations are using APIs today?
Oh, it's everything, right? So I spend a lot of time talking to organizations, making them understand that at the end of the day, APIs really are the nervous system to all the applications that not only we consume, that we're developing and that we're innovating on. So it really is changing obviously how we develop apps and how quickly we can build apps and put them out into the market and update and advanced applications. So, as I mentioned before, it really is at the center of everything that we are doing. And you said something interesting at the beginning of this, is when I talk to a lot of companies and organizations and peers in the industry, and we talk about, their API journey. A lot of organizations still have not come to the realization that they are on an API first journey, and they are already there today, and that they've already proliferated around their organization, and their businesses rely on it, and everything they're doing from a delivery standpoint relies on it. So it's really interesting that at this point, a lot of times we're still having that conversation, trying to put that mindset in a lot of folks' heads that, listen, it's APIs aren't just something that I'm using Postman or connecting to a third party. They are literally integral to everything that we're building and we're developing today.
Yeah. And that sort of goes on to the next point around modernization for APIs. And, I think as companies, there's this whole marketing terminology of digital transformation, right? When we've been talking about this for years now, and moving to the cloud and different things like that. But from my perspective, as folks are doing this modernization or this cloud journey or whatever you want to call it, APIs are becoming more and more impactful, and there's a huge increase in the usage of APIs, like you just mentioned. Are you able to provide any specific examples when you've talked to customers about their digital transformation or their modernization across their IT infrastructure, how that sort of shows up in the real world, how these APIs sort of show up in that real world use case?
Yeah, there's a few different ones. I mean, obviously, there's the digital transformations that we hear a lot of organizations talking about. I'm moving from my monolith, or breaking up my monolith, and I'm moving to microservices. And a lot of organizations were doing that in parallel with actually moving to the cloud. So, as we're actually going to be moving our resources out of our data centers into the cloud, maybe that's a great time for us. A lot of organizations thought it was a good time to actually change the architecture as well, move to this distributed architecture. So that is still a lot of the, big driver for a lot of organizations. We're also seeing that a lot of organizations are leveraging, as they're modernizing, their API call chains. These business processes now take, multiple API calls, and a lot of these calls are exposed to the outside world, these business processes. But these call chains, or these supply chains from an API standpoint, rely on third parties as well. So from a modernization standpoint, it's not just the consumption and the production of my APIs, but it's also the requirement or the dependency on the third party APIs as well. And then we have a lot of organizations who are embracing a lot of the modernization and the sort of the next gen technology. So, for example, a lot of orgs and companies, when we talk about modernization, it also is, I'm changing our UI. I'm deploying a new mobile application, or, this headless UI movement where everything is rendered on the client side, but the data is all driven by APIs. So those are three major buckets that we're seeing from a modernization standpoint that a lot of organizations are wrestling with.
Right, for sure. Yeah, it's one of those things that we've been talking about. Digital transformations moving to the cloud for, I don't know, 10 years or something. And of course, APIs are a huge part of that. And so I'm sure, as you said, the companies are just trying to figure out how do we do this digital transformation that's best for our business, but also make sure that every part of that, including all the API usage, it doesn't introduce, unneeded risk within our organization. The other thing, of course, that I talk about, I've talked to, throughout my career in security, is always these regulations and regulatory compliance laws and different things like that. I don't know that they've caught up yet. So, obviously, like I said, been here about a month and I've done a bunch of research into this. I don't know that the regulations have actually caught up with the challenges that APIs might bring to an organization. But have you seen, are there shifts in regulations, whether it's North America or European Union type regulations that sort of try and wrangle in the challenge of APIs? Have you seen anything like that?
Yeah, we're seeing this movement where there's a lot of now API terminology that's finding their ways into a lot of the regulatory docs, all the draft documentation. You take a look at open banking or GDPR, a lot of other, sort of regulatory forces that organizations are trying to adhere to. The interesting thing from an organization or an enterprise standpoint, a lot of organizations have tried to adopt what they were doing in the web world to try to facilitate, to try to use that as the blanket that will hopefully cover APIs. Fortunately, we're finding a lot of organizations are finding out that it's not a complete one-to-one mapping on what they were doing in web from a web app standpoint and APIs.
Gotcha.
But we're seeing a lot of drivers, a lot of organizations right now, especially in the financial services sector, really have their eyes set on open banking and how that's going to be affecting them and what they need to do to get in line for that. Here in the States, we're seeing some API specific language show up in a lot of state specific regulations or data privacy regulations. So it's not just the, GDPR, PCI, those type of things, but it's also what's specific to California, what's specific to New York State. And so it's interesting to see a lot of the local governing bodies are starting to incorporate a lot of the terminology specifically focused and taking a look at specifically focused on APIs.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like obviously the customers, organizations are on this API journey, but there's also regulators and others that are on this journey as well, trying to figure out how they can enforce and provide guidance, I guess it was, as it were, on these APIs as well. So more on that to come for sure. The next one that we talk about a lot is DevOps IDP and how APIs are sort of part of that process. Are you able to provide any sort of insight onto this one, on specific on the DevOps side and IDP, and how APIs can become a challenge for organizations?
Yeah, for this, when we think about APIs and API security, I think the first thing that's sort of top of mind for a lot of organizations is the APIs that I'm exposing to the outside world. What's my attack surface look like? But the interesting thing from an API proliferation standpoint, a lot of organizations are really struggling with APIs inside their walls. And one of the biggest elements of that proliferation inside organizations is the advancements of integrated development platforms. So DevOps specifically, everything when we talk about APIs and CI/CD and pipeline automations, all of that is API driven. All of those technologies and tools and tooling that's actually being deployed are all APIs. And so, API security is not just what am I exposing to the outside world? It's, what if somebody gets inside my walls? What if someone gets inside my network? There is a plethora of interfaces available to a bad actor once they're inside the gate. And so API security really encompasses all of those internal APIs. And a lot of times we call those ghost APIs. These are APIs that are being introduced into your organization that are outside of your governance, that are third-party APIs that we're taking advantage of, that we're using them daily, but they're not inventoried. Security is really not looking at them, and they do expose you from a risk standpoint.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. The uncertainty or the lack of visibility into anything in the IT world is a major challenge, especially if you're using APIs that are touching all this potentially sensitive data. If you don't even know they exist, then that can cause a lot of problems. The next one is around sort of the monetization side of it. In the past, like I said, I've been doing security 20 years and securing APIs compared to other sort of IT assets, email or web or whatever, hasn't been, I don't think, as much of a forefront thought from a lot of companies in the past. But I think as we see more monetization happening around APIs, it's causing some more thought around that. So what are some of the ways with the monetization that organizations need to sort of change the way in how they treat APIs, specifically tied to that monetization aspect of it?
For a lot of organizations, APIs have turned into products. They are a product. They're a headless product. And if you kind of run the numbers and look at a lot of businesses and across all the different verticals, there is some monetization aspect to basically every API that's being produced, whether it's supporting it is supporting a particular business process that is, revenue generating. And then there's the other part of it where I have data and I have information that people want, and I want to create sort of that low cost self-service interface so I can actually monetize that data. So, I mean, my argument is that everything is sort of monetized from an API standpoint. If they're supporting your business, there's some monetary value associated to how those APIs are actually helping support the business. But traditionally, monetization is, how do I productize this and how do I put a price on it and how do I charge someone to actually use this API? Think of a weather application, for example, or a stock trading application or news application. If I have something proprietary, I want to be able to sell it to the outside world. And again, a lot of folks are really focused on how can I take my business and how can I monetize the data that I have and do it. And, APIs are really, really non-abrasive way to do that, right? I just create an interface, I put it to the outside world, and I figure out how to make money off of it.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. And as soon as there's that kind of, data that's being transmitted amongst these things, you really need to treat, I think the end idea here is you really need to treat APIs as a critical IT asset, as just like I said, as if it was, email or web traffic or whatever else. It really needs to be in that same sort of bucket as far as securing it and getting the visibility into it and that sort of thing. And then the final one to talk about, of course, is AI. And AI is ubiquitous at this point. Everybody's talking about AI. And so as we think about AI when it comes to APIs, can you provide a little bit of insight into sort of how AI is both negatively and positively affecting things in terms of API usage? I know obviously, there's probably AI that can go out there and create APIs and this kind of stuff, and maybe figure out, cracks in the seams when it comes to APIs to sort of dig into the security aspect of it. But is there any other views from your perspective on how AI is going to change what it means to use APIs within organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the accelerators for proliferation in a lot of organizations and large enterprises, specifically right now, just because so many organizations have some type of artificial intelligence or MLL plan that's in place over the next 24 months. And whether, if it is a new business process or I'm making business decisions, or if I have a new product that's AI driven, the interesting thing there is that AI brain, as I mentioned before, the APIs really are the nervous system for that brain. They're carrying, AI needs data. APIs are the data transport for everything. And the interesting thing is, if we take a look at, again, all these companies and organizations and the different verticals, all that data that's being transported is all, for the most cases, really, really sensitive data that's feeding a lot of these decisions that are coming from this. So that's one part. The second part that's interesting from an AI standpoint is from a risk analysis standpoint, we are seeing developers leverage AI every day, or we have a lot of AI generated processes that are actually building APIs today. And we've seen a lot of developer surveys over the last 6 months from various organizations, and the numbers are pretty staggering, where a majority of developers are saying, yeah, I definitely use AI on the outside of the corporate fences to validate my code, or I'm actually using that AI to help me generate code, outside of any corporate governance. So that is another big part of it as well. It's not just obviously helping, it's not just sort of proliferating and accelerating the production of APIs, but it's actually impacting how we're developing APIs as well. Developers are already doing this today. So that's another major concern from an API security standpoint right now.
Yeah, I mean, dramatically over time is going to increase that threat landscape potentially, right? As far as if you can use APIs to just spin up these, or AI to spin up these APIs super fast, I mean, it can dramatically increase that, and figuring out how to control that and secure it is going to be a big challenge for customers and organizations as they go forward. I'm going to do one more poll question here, just a quick one. Obviously we know that APIs are critical in nature, but I want to know from your perspective as an organization, how many APIs are being used in production within your organization? So just curious to see that. And obviously, what with the interesting number, well, the numbers there are interesting with 100 plus. It's good to see that. The unsure number, that can be a challenge, but yeah, what do you think of those numbers? I mean, that's as you see, and I don't know I might have needed to make this poll go up to like 1,000 plus, right? I don't know what those numbers look like, but even with 100 plus APIs in use, from an organizational perspective, that can cause, a lot of potential risk, right? If, as you say, these APIs are touching confidential data and everything else, that can be a major problem. And then that unsure number there, Nick, is not great either, right? I mean, like we've been talking about, we need to understand the API landscape within an organization. If you're unsure, then definitely we need to figure out ways to make that more of a certainty.
Yeah,
Uh,
same thing. And then what's an API? That's the other, obviously,
yeah.
I always get back, were we talking about endpoints? Am I talking about API products? So the two numbers I typically see are, very big 100 plus, and then the unsure number, which is I
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so let's go to the next slide here, and we'll talk about some of the API risks that are associated, and we'll just maybe cover this pretty quickly. But the first one, as we've been speaking with customers, we continue, and you've already sort of alluded to this, Nick, that we've continued to hear that they're sort of struggling to wrap their arms around their API usage. And that poll sort of alluded to this, right? People don't even know how many APIs they have in production. So organizations might not be prepared to even think about posture governance. Can you provide a little detail on what posture governance means at a very high level, and sort of why it's important for organizations to start to think about it and start having plans around formulating some kind of API posture governance within their organization?
Yeah, one of the interesting things here, and this is gonna, and for the attendees, this is gonna flow right into sort of what that risk reduction journey looks like, and what we are sort of preaching to customers here, and the product and the platform that we have in place to help customers reduce risk. But one of the problems that we're solving is exactly this. It's this notion of bad API posture governance, and it encompasses a few different things. First is exactly what that poll said: is I don't even know what I have.
Mhm.
And the interesting things from an API standpoint is if we take a look at the breaches that have happened over the last, let's say 5 years, from like 2018 to the present, it's the attacks and the breaches that we're seeing. The barrier to breach have been pretty low. They're not really, I mean, there are some sophisticated attacks, but for the most part, pretty low barrier to breach, pretty simple attack types. And the reason for that is bad posture. And the other interesting thing there is most attacks, the majority of attacks, are done against API assets that the enterprise already knows about. So I already know it's out there. I already have some of my defenses against it, looking at it, I tested it, but I still got hit. And so that's where posture governance comes into it. It's not just knowing, yes, that there's an API that's out there. It is the understanding of that API is an IT asset, so I have to treat it as an IT asset.
Okay.
And I have to know what it does, the data that in motion associated with it, who it belongs to, what its business purpose is, and is it adhering to some type of standard? Is it adhering to best practices? Is it adhering to corporate standards, which we'll talk about more in a couple minutes here? And is it adhering to any regulatory requirements? But again, that notion of how do I know, is it good? And I always ask folks, do you know what APIs are out there? Do you trust your APIs? And do you even know what a good API is? Have you sort of set that bar? And
Right.
does everyone in your organization know what that bar is?
Got it. Yeah, and I think that's the big one, is like trying to figure out a way to bring everybody together that's a stakeholder within this, right? I mean, it's not just folks that are writing these APIs or just the security team or whatever. I think that, a cross function, you've got to come together and sort of figure this challenge out. One of the other things we've seen as far as this goes is that obviously with APIs, and like we've been talking about, they can potentially hold very confidential data, or that data is flowing through these APIs. And as such, of course, attackers are trying to figure out ways. And as you say, there can be very low
Barrier to breach.
entry kind of attacks that go into API traffic, right? And so, can you give some ideas on, and as you say, there's been tools in place, there's been, WAFs and API gateways and different things, but can you give some ideas of around why that might not be enough anymore, just to have a WAF or an API gateway in place to solve some of these API security risks, challenges?
I mean, the amount of proliferation, how fast this has exploded in a lot of organizations, really caught a lot of organizations, I think, off guard. One of the first things that organizations I did, as I mentioned before, is all the processes and tooling and security, security that frameworks that we have in place. for the web, I'm going to use those for APIs. And so they immediately threw that blanket on top of it and said, I should be good to go here.
Mm-hmm.
Found out really quickly in a lot of places that that is not enough, that API attacks are different. So the interesting here is that, attackers and bad actors and adversaries, they're really good at masquerading API attacks to look like normal, normal traffic. And it's
Okay.
very, very hard to pick it up. A lot of the defenses that are in place today are looking for the known bad. I'm looking for a pattern or signature. A lot of attacks that we're seeing today are misconfiguration-based attacks that I'm taking advantage of, or logic-based, something that was written in code
Got
that
it.
the API is actually responding to, that I'm able to induce some negative behavior. So that is that's something that's been a lot of organizations have been struggling with. Is okay, great, that blanket from my web defenses I threw over isn't enough. What do I do from here?
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep, exactly. And the known, just detecting on known bad is definitely not good enough in this space, especially with the proliferation of APIs and the amount of data they touch. And then finally, the other one we've seen a lot of is that, traditional IT ecosystems have in the past sort of lacked this broad visibility that we've been talking about a little bit already, specifically at the API level. So what are some of the ways to improve that API awareness across sort of the organization's entire ecosystem? What are you seeing? What are you seeing customers do there?
Yeah, this is a major issue for a lot of organizations, is that API security, I always say, is a team sport. It's not just one technology or platform that's going to check the box for you and you're ready to go. It really is something that requires the whole ecosystem, API lifecycle ecosystem, to be in tune with. And it's all the way from your personas. Like I mentioned before, do I have that corporate standard that my developers, when they're designing an API, when my architects, when they're architecting the infrastructure, when AppSec, when they're testing the API, and operations, when they're monitoring an API, are they all adhering to the same standard? Do they even know what that standard is? Most organizations, as we saw in the first poll, no, that standard has not been set.
Yeah.
So that's one big problem. The second thing is, a lot of the technology defenses that organizations have zero API awareness. So this notion of defense in depth is something that organizations are struggling with. They don't have the threat intel of that API awareness to be even able to take action against an API threat. And a lot of organizations want to leverage the investments they've already made from a security infrastructure standpoint. And that is a threat intel that a lot of those systems don't have access to today.
Yeah, the defense in depth sort of stops at the API level, and the API level it's not like that's the bottom of the ocean, right? I mean, you got to keep going and being able to have tools that can provide that visibility and that defense in depth at that extended level through the APIs. Great info there. So we're going to go through the next slide. This is sort of talking about different categories of breaches. We won't spend a whole lot of time here. You can find all kinds of different breaches out there about all kinds of different avenues,
I would say let's just build this one out. We'll go quick.
Yeah, we'll just build this one out. So the first one is around lack of visibility and governance, right? I mean, this is just what we've already been talking about. So companies don't have that visibility and that governance aspect of their APIs in general. Are there any examples of that you could point to?
Yeah, lots of examples of this, and this is when attackers are taking advantage of some type of misconfiguration. There's I'd say the few and far in between attacks that we're seeing, like the one that happened in Australia just recently or last year, where an API was out there, the organization didn't know about it. It was an accident, but information was exfiltrated out of it. But most of the attacks we're seeing is just bad governance. We saw a ancestry and genetic secret, genetic evaluation application provider get hit recently. Still dealing with a lot of legal repercussions of that. And that was just bad posture of the API. So I put this product out there. I know about the product, but again, I don't have the gates in place to build that standard. And so we're seeing a lot of that, a lot of those breach types out there.
Yeah, and then abuse and misuse of potential is that's, those are properly used APIs and they're being used as designed, but the attacker or maybe an internal user can use the results in unintended or malicious manner, right? I mean, that's I think there's oftentimes we see that across different security avenues where something is legit, but the attacker or malicious bad actor tries to find a way around that to use it maliciously, and APIs are one of those factors as well.
And yeah, you hit it right on its head. The API is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, except I just didn't think when I developed it or I deployed it, how a adversary or a bad actor could take advantage of it. And this is a lot of the scraping attacks that we've seen today. We've seen it in a lot of the social media. We've seen it on sort of the peer-to-peer, payment scraping. So we've seen it on FBI InfraGard had an example of this where someone kind of got into the app and then was able to scrape an API that was used to do lookups and send messages to another particular user. So yeah, this is this notion of exactly that. I built something, but it's functionally doing what it's supposed to be doing to facilitate a business process, but I just didn't think in sort of the mind of an adversary how it can be misused.
And does that sort of tie into that business logic flaws a little bit? So it could be a known good API, but they're sort of changing the usage of it to create some kind of negative behavior at the back end. Is that sort of, are those sort of related in a little bit of way? Or are they completely different? How do you see that third one there?
A bit different, because a business logic flaw is where I'm doing something to an API to actually induce a negative behavior.
Okay.
Right? It's not the standard behavior. So
Gotcha.
yes, it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, but if I poke or prod, or if I change a parameter a slight way, I may want to I'm inducing some type of negative behavior. And that could be giving me access to another user's data. It could be doing something with the API that actually is making the back end take up a lot of compute, or respond back with a 500. So now I'm creating an inventory of API endpoints that could be used for low traffic denial of service. I don't even have to use a lot of traffic now. If I know how to poke and prod you the right way, I can essentially take down key parts of your API supply chains, so that I can break a business process. So we're seeing that just past year with some of the stuff that the researcher Sam Curry did, was able to show that he was able to walk up to a lot of vehicles in their windshield, see the VIN number, open his laptop, and essentially unlock the doors of the car and start the car remotely. So that's a great example of something that let's say a developer left behind that an attacker is able to find and take advantage of.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we all love being able to unlock our car with our phone or whatever it is, but most people don't even understand the backend systems that go into that. Like, there's APIs involved with all this work, right? So if an attacker can figure out a way to break into that traffic and create some negative behavior out of it, they will do that for sure. And then finally, of course, stolen credentials, social engineering, those things have been around for ages at this point, right? And of course, if attackers can steal credentials, they can cause all kinds of unknown harm within an organization. So what are you seeing around that specifically as it's tying to sort of privileged API usage or whatever within an organization?
We're seeing some of the more sophisticated attacks are starting with the first wave of social engineering, right? They're getting, it's a targeted, like a spearfish attack, where they're phishing attack where they are specifically looking at a particular user or a particular job role in an organization. I'm trying to get into trying to get past that front door. And once I'm inside, a lot of organizations are like, okay, if an adversary gets access to a privileged API key, if they scan our source code repository, what do I have in my defense arsenal to be able to actually detect when an API abuse or misuse is taking place, if the bad actor is using a key that gives them authentication authorization rights to use that API. So that's also a big concern for a lot of organizations. If social engineering gets them through the front door, what do I have on the inside of the house to be able to actually detect that something bad's happening?
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's crazy stuff. And as we all know, if you're in the security space, the attackers are finding ways to do malicious things with whatever tools they have at their disposal. And as we continue to use APIs more and more, I think the attackers will find ways to unfortunately exploit these as well, which is not great. So if we talk about all this, then we go into what sort of a strategy, right? What can an organization do to sort of start locking things down, right? And I think the first one we want to talk about is the initial risk reduction, right? What can we do quickly to help solve some of the risks associated or potentially associated with the APIs that are in use within an organization, right? I think the first one that's very important is understanding what kind of risks APIs might cause. As was mentioned before, and we've been talking about, unfortunately, there's not a lot of tools out there, or there's not a lot of threat intel out there that is API specific, right? And if you don't know what's bad, you don't even know really what to look for. And so it's really important from a strategy perspective to understand what are the risks associated with APIs, And then how does that tie back to my organization? And then, of course, once we know around what the API asset inventory look like, what the threat posture looks like based on that asset inventory, then we can start acting on that intelligence, right? And this is how we can quickly start applying risk reduction strategies within an organization. From there, you want to talk about, okay, we understand this, we've started to reduce some of this risk. What do we do from here? Of course, most organizations are going to have all kinds of different security tools, different SOARs, different SIMs, all this different security technology within the organization. How can we start sharing this API threat intelligence or API intelligence in general across the organization to ensure as we continue this digital transformation, as we continue using more and more APIs, we have some kind of long-term strategy in place. It's not just like a one-time thing and we're done. It's really something that you're going to have to continue through the long process of doing this. And so I think having those plans in place is really important. When I look at this overall, of course, I think, well, that's complex, right? There's probably a lot of teams involved with this within an organization. How can an organization sort of, do this simply? I think, Nick, when we talk about this, I think, we want to talk to security folks, but there's other teams involved here. What's an idea of a process that can be started for an organization to wrap their arms around this? What kind of teams should be initially involved with these kind of discussions to get this process started from your discussions you've had with different companies?
I think for a lot of organizations, first is to get their arms around the fact that this is a strategy problem, like you said before. I think in the last couple of years is the first couple of years we've actually seen API security get its own budget items with a lot of organizations, but they were buying tools and technologies. There was no strategy in place. It was like, no, I'm just going to put this, I'm going to buy this new testing tool, or I'm going to put this technology in line, or replace my WAF from A to B because B says it has some type of API security with it.
Yeah.
There's no strategy there. So we were seeing no real risk reduction taking place. So that first piece was really getting a lot of organizations, like you said, helping get their arms around what do I have right now and how can I reduce risk of what of the current IT assets that I currently have in place, or the API assets that I currently have in place today. So, and that's the whole persona chain from designers all the way to operations that really needs to be involved there. And that's kind of step one of the strategy. And like you said, in step two really is, I want to make sure that everything I'm doing long-term, everything I design, everything I develop, every time we mention the word API or an API is in use anywhere, that I trust, as I mentioned before, I trust that it's going to be developed and designed and deployed to that level of good that I spoke about before. But like I said, from a persona standpoint, everybody, this is, it's all hands on decks. I will say the interesting thing with this is that we're seeing a lot of organizations use the same footprints they used in the cloud compute security challenge. We're removing a lot of, those same committees, the cloud governance committees, the data integration committees, are all getting together again to talk about exactly this. And that's what's been going on in a lot of organizations end of last year going into this year is, okay, now let's talk about what this strategy looks like. Let's take the lessons we've learned from cloud compute, and now we have to apply it to APIs, because these are, a lot of organizations, the first time they're recognizing them as true, IT assets.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. As you say, a lot of folks are going to be involved with this, but depending on who you are on this call today, as you think through securing APIs, risk reduction strategies with APIs, you need to think bigger than just your individual function or your individual team. It's something you've got to bring in multiple different, heck, legal might be involved. There's all kinds of different teams that might be involved with these kinds of, especially the broad strategic view on this. So just think more broadly with that and bring a good group of folks together to help solve some of these problems. Okay, so I'm going to do one more poll question before we go on to sort of our final slide. And let's launch this poll real quick. So the question is, has your organization defined a corporate standard for API production and usage? So yes, we have someone in use. We have something in progress. No, but we're planning on it. And then not at this time. We'll give it another 10 seconds or so for folks to chime in on this question. It's good. The majority so far have something in use, which is good. It's good news. But there's still looks like there could be quite a bit of work for other folks to do. Anything you're thinking about on those results for that question,
Yeah, I think the one thing that's jumping out is pretty interesting that there's a good percentage, like 30+% are saying that they have one in use. But when we asked the question earlier about posture governance standards or program in place, vast majority of them, didn't. So I think that'd be interesting, because I think that's a little bit of where the disconnect is.
Mhm.
Um, from what does posture governance mean? We're going to talk about that obviously in the next slide here, but
Yep.
yeah, uh, interesting response. Almost a third are saying that this is something that's currently in process, and again, still a large percentage really does not,
Don't have anything.
not yet, but not at this time, still not on the horizon, that this is something that's being addressed.
Yeah, if you have 100 plus APIs out there, or you're unsure about how many APIs, you'd hope that number for yes and use would be a little higher, but hopefully we'll have some ideas on how to do that. So I'm gonna go ahead and build this next slide out. So the posture governance is what we'll talk about first, and then we'll talk about the behavioral protection side of that. I think, as we've talked about, it's really this journey that needs to take place for organizations. And we think that the first starting point for that is around the posture governance side, right? You need to understand what you've got before you can start applying different security rules or providing sort of risk reduction strategies. If you don't understand what you got, then it's going to be very hard to do that. First question I had, Nick, for you is, as we've been talking about, understanding APIs and discovering APIs is really important for organizations. Can you give any sort of eye-opening API discovery insights that you've been involved with customers? If you've talked to customers about their API discovery journeys, has there been any sort of eye-opening thing like, oh, this customer had thought they had 30 APIs and we found they had 1,000, or anything sort of stand out to you with those discussions you've had with customers?
The big thing is universally that what you think is wrong. I think it's been pretty universal across the case.
Yeah.
And to me, that means a couple different things. And if I kind of just take a step back on this slide for a second, when we talk about this risk reduction journey, when organizations are coming to me and say, okay, great, that strategy that we talked about before, that's perfect, but what does that strategy look like from a reality standpoint? How Salt Security, can you guide me on that journey? What does that look like? For pretty much every organization, that first leg of the journey is API posture governance. And that first piece of the journey, as you just mentioned, Eric, is this notion of, I need to mine intelligence out of the API assets that I have.
Mm-hmm.
And like I mentioned before, most organizations know where the crown jewels are. They know where most of their API workloads run. So discovering API assets is, yes, it's absolutely understanding what that attack surface looks like from a surface exposure standpoint. That's absolutely part of it. The other part of it that is also very, very important is this notion of, as I mentioned before, I need to understand everything there is to know about the APIs, just like I need to understand for a cloud, compute resource. I need to know how it's used, who owns it, what business functions is it related to, what's the data associated with it, because all of that is very important to actually reduce risk associated with it and to actually secure it in an operational state from a runtime perspective. So that is very, very important. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of organizations want to actually capture this information. They want to capture the information because, again, these API endpoints are being seen as IT assets now, and they're finding their ways for the first time into CMDBs like a ServiceNow. And so we have a lot of the large enterprises that I work with, they're actually mapping those API endpoints inside their CMDB, just like they would for any other IT asset, which is really interesting to see. So that's an important piece for them. The other thing that we're seeing from an asset standpoint is, and again, and if I talk a little bit about Salt Security now from a feature function standpoint, in terms of some of the things that we actually just introduced, is this.
Yeah, I was going to ask about some recent stuff that we've launched back a couple weeks ago. So if you want to share that, that'd be great.
Yeah. So from a threat hunting standpoint, we hear that term a lot. One of the things that folks want to be able to do from an API asset standpoint is what we call risk hunting. I need to accumulate all this data of my API assets, and I just want the ability to have that data at my disposal so I can query and learn. How am I using, what does my population of my API assets look like? Because once I have a good understanding there, I can move to that next, bubble or dot on the screen there. And that is, I can help define, is this good or is it not? Based on what that API does, am I comfortable with the posture of the API, the attributes of the API? And that's really what that second that second bullet.
Yeah, and that, I was
Is
going to ask about that. So, obviously understanding all this information about APIs is critical first step to this journey of reducing risk across your API landscape. Can you specifically, I know, like we talked about, we did this do a recent launch here, and one of the big things we talked about within that launch was our posture governance engine that I think sort of ties in, as you were talking about, with the standards and assessment and that kind of thing. Can you give a little context around that posture governance engine that we recently launched out there in the wild?
Yeah, it has to do a lot with, as I mentioned before, this notion of what is good to us. What is good
Yeah.
to my organization, my business. And like I mentioned before, these, cloud governance committees are getting together and they're basically building what is good. They're building those standards. They're putting them in a PDF. They're putting them in a Word doc. And the problem with that is once that's etched in stone, how does the ecosystem use it? How does that standard become set to life? And that's where a lot of organizations are really struggling right now. They tried to one off in silos, jump all over this slide here, but they really have not buttoned down exactly what does good actually look, and how do I make sure that everybody's following, living to that benchmark. So from a technology standpoint, we understood that a lot of organizations were going through that right now, defining what is good. A couple of things that we wanted to do. We wanted to give organizations the ability to help bring that to life. A lot of organizations need the ability to take their standard and put it somewhere. They need to document it somewhere so that it will impact everything from how an API is designed to how we actually monitor it into production and how we test it in between. And so that was what we built with the posture engine. It is a policy engine that allows you to bring those standards to life and be able to actually, again, educate, impact, and assess that you're following those standards. And now the interesting thing when I talk about a standard could be a bunch of different things. You may have a simple standard that says, hey, I never want to see an API ever respond back with anything other than a 404 and a 200. Right? Simple standard, right? Really simple thing you'd think. But if everybody's not educated on that simple standard, and I have no source of truth to go to actually pull and incorporate into my life cycle, it's very, very difficult, even for that one simple standard, to be able to have a high degree of confidence that everything that I'm developing and deploying and using is actually adhering to that standard. But that's one standard. Most organizations will have hundreds and hundreds of standards based on their business. And I'll say the other interesting thing that we've done here is we didn't want to give our customers a blank slate from a posture standard standpoint. So one of the interesting things that we've done with this particular technology is really helped. We've put in some industry best practices, obviously from a standard standpoint, but this is a technology and a library that's going to grow over time. This whole notion of the network effect of all of our customers by data type, by industry type. We're really excited about this sort of notion of this policy engine, giving recommendations but also giving you sort of the starters you need to help, because a lot of organizations are starting at really ground zero where they haven't even started to, etch in stone any of their standards. So we want to give them a good place to start, not just a policy engine that's completely blank and empty.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I think that's one of the posture governance engine is one of our differentiators in the space that's really going to help this process because, again, many people are still on this journey, and our posture governance engine, I think, is going to be a big leg up to getting this over the finish line as customers are working through this. I don't even know the finish line is near term, but as you work through the journey, it'll be easier. The other big part of all of this is the behavioral threat protection side of it, right? Being able to detect and respond to threats, obviously understanding what's going on with the API ecosystem is critical. So that first part when we discover APIs really allows us to detect threats and respond to those threats within your API ecosystem. So I think that's a huge differentiator for us. We released recently in that same launch some capabilities that enhanced our behavioral threat capabilities within this. So we can actually look at those things that a standard WAF API gateway is not going to see, the sort of the low and slow type attacks. The behavioral threat capabilities are really going to allow us to do that. And then finally, of course, both of these lead into that ecosystem that we've already talked about, where we can have both the posture governance and the behavioral threat protection filtering information into your organization's broader IT ecosystem to have ecosystem enrichment and really pull out the threads of things that are the most severe or potentially damaging within your organization. Are there anything in the ecosystem enrichment that you want to share that we've just recently launched?
Yeah, on both sides, there's two components of this that are important. As I mentioned before, this whole notion that API security is a team sport. One of the big things that come out of the ecosystem enrichment, even on the first line, the posture governance standpoint, is I want to share my posture intelligence. One of the initial places to do that, obviously, with developers and how they design and build APIs. This is also something that can feed LLMs, right? As I mentioned before, if I'm leveraging AI to build APIs, they need to know what those guardrails are that for a particular organization and what is a good API. This also impacts AppSec as well in the testing technology. So we purposely as a company did not go down the testing path and build a testing framework because it is pretty tribal in a lot of organizations in terms of the testing technology and the frameworks that are used. What we've done is we've worked and we've partnered with all the major testing companies that are out there from a feature function integration standpoint, so that we have the ability to share the posture intelligence. And that posture intelligence could be, what are my APIs that are out there? How, give me enriched OAS specifications so I can test them more effectively. So I'm not just testing them on the surface like a web application. So that's the integration that we've done, there from an ecosystem enrichment standpoint, to make sure that all the lifecycle tools, API lifecycle tools, from design to deployment, can leverage this data. On the behavioral threat protection side, it's a lot of the intelligence is really to help. How do I stop a threat? Can I leverage? I've invested a lot in a CrowdStrike. I want to do my enforcement there. Can you share the threat intel if there's a bad actor and an active attack campaign going on? Can I block that attacker with my CrowdStrike investment, my existing WAF investment? So those are, can I operationalize this with syslog or my CM or my SOAR that I already have in place? So those are the type of, sharing the threat intel that's important. And then obviously from an ecosystem standpoint, from an operationalization standpoint, it's that flywheel of if I see something bad in runtime or if I see a bad posture, even as things are being written and deployed, I need to be able to integrate with the tooling that I already have in place. So if it's, for example, Jira, if I see, a bad behavior that needs to be fixed or a bad posture, I need to make sure I have all the piping in place there. So that's really all has to do with the ecosystem enrichment, to make sure that it's one thing to capture the data, but I have to operationalize, this to actually effectively reduce risk. And now that
make it useful to act on it. So cool. We're going to go to the final slide, and then we'll have a couple minutes here for Q&A. But again, I want to thank everybody for your time. And Salt is a leader when it comes to sort of that risk reduction journey. As we've talked about, we did a recent release around our posture governance engine, which is going to provide a lot more capabilities as you work through this within your organization, as you work through how do you reduce risk, what are my API challenges? We have a lot of tools in place within our ecosystem, within our solution set that's going to help solve those problems, right? We have, and as you see, we have a bunch of companies there who are using these solutions and are very satisfied with them. We do have obviously some strong investment, and we have the ability to continue making the product and the solution set better and better. The other thing we didn't really talk about too much is Salt Labs, which is our threat research team. As we've talked about a little bit, understanding these API risks and how do you detect and prevent and block the most critical or sort of 0-day type things. We have a very great team on the Salt Lab side that's doing a lot of good research on that again feeds back into the broader solution stack to help make sure everything is secure for folks as they work through these APIs. So I have a couple of questions I want to touch on. Maybe you can help with these ones, Nick, that I've got. There's one here says, one typical question coming from clients, maybe a partner of ours, is how do we secure traffic which is going out using an API or using APIs?
Great question, because it's not just the APIs that I'm producing, it's the APIs that I'm also consuming that need to secure. And especially even if I didn't build the API, if I'm sending my data to my API, I'm still responsible for my data, even though I'm using a third-party API. So what a lot of organizations are doing right now is obviously this is a platform that has the ability to do that from from our platform's perspective, from Salt Security's perspective. But it's just a matter of actually, for example, if I want to monitor for this thing and to to find these assets and to secure them, I need to know that they're there. I need to see the traffic of them. So it's interesting. A lot of organizations are trying to find where am I using third-party APIs, but they're trying to normalize third-party API usage to their API gateway. So that API gateways are being frameworked now or built or architected, not just to take incoming requests, but they're also being leveraged because they realize that APIs, third-party APIs are part of the API supply chain, that the API gateways that they manage they want them to be the conduit to anything that uses a third-party API. So that is an architecture that we are seeing catch a lot of steam right now. It has been over the last couple of years. I expect we're going to see this, more and more this year, but it's a best practice. Use your API gateway. Make sure that you have a standard that if someone is going to, or a business function or technology or code is going to use a third-party API, that API can only be accessed through whatever the corporate standard API gateway is, and you block everything else.
Yeah, cool. And then we'll just do one more question here before we wrap up. So this question was, our API standard rules are defined in Swagger files. Can your solution identify conflict between the spec and the API configuration?
Yeah, it's a great question, because a lot of organizations there's lots of debates about, design first, spec first, how fast, and how quick and fast do I move my organization there, because it is a best practice. Yeah, from our platform's perspective, there's a couple of things we do from a best practice standpoint. We verify that these specs are adhering to best practices. The second thing that we do is we will do sort of that contract analysis or drift analysis for you as well, and say, here's the spec, here's actually what the API functionally or in production or in staging, this is actually what it looks like. And here's the drift between the two. It looks like you have not adhered to that particular standard. Problem is right now is getting those standards inside the Swagger definition. So the first step for a lot of organizations is going to our policy engine, making sure the standards are documented, and then from there, that's the launch pad to, okay, how can I make sure that all of our specifications are actually adhering to these standards? So even before a line of code is written, that I have some governance and guidance on, how the building should be blueprinted.
Gotcha. Cool. So I just want to thank everybody again for your time today. We are going to wrap it here. What I would suggest, one more thing, if you go to that URL, salt.security/blog, Nick, I think just a couple of weeks ago, maybe a week ago or so, released a great blog in regards to some of the newer capabilities that we launched. So I would definitely go check that out. It'll go a lot into the posture governance side and risk reduction overall, but it's a great blog to read through if you wanted a little more detail on how we're actually doing it within the solution. So again, thanks for your time, and hope you got some good information today, and we will hopefully talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Enjoy your week.
Thanks, Nick.